Elizabeth I ruled England for over 44 years and is remembered as one of its greatest monarchs. Her reign saw the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the flourishing of Shakespeare and the arts, and the rise of England as a global power. It was the age of the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, good Queen Bess, a golden age. But how did Elizabeth achieve all of this? And what was her reign really like for her people and for those who lived through it? I'm historian and author Claire Ridgway, and let me tell you more about Elizabeth I and her reign. As you'll know from my previous videos on Elizabeth, she became queen on the 17th of November 1558 at the age of 25. But her path there had been anything but easy. Elizabeth was the daughter of King Henry VIII by Anne Boleyn, his second wife, who'd been executed for high treason when Elizabeth was just 2 years old. And Elizabeth herself had been declared illegitimate by an Act of Parliament. At various points she'd been removed from the succession altogether, her future uncertain. Her position became even more precarious during her youth. In 1549, during her half-brother Edward VI's reign, she was caught up in the Thomas Seymour scandal, facing intense interrogation. Then, in 1554, during her half-sister Mary I's reign, Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower of London on suspicion of involvement in Wyatt's rebellion. For a time, it seemed entirely possible that she might share her mother's fate. And yet she survived. Through caution, intelligence, and careful self-preservation, Elizabeth managed to navigate these dangers and retain her place as Mary's heir. It was quite the achievement when she became queen in 1558. One of the first and most pressing issues of Elizabeth's reign was marriage. It wasn't just idle curiosity or court gossip. Marriage for the Queen was a matter of national importance. A monarch was expected to secure the succession, and that meant having an heir and a spare, ideally. And in the 16th century, a queen was not expected to rule alone. Marriage was seen as essential. A husband could provide military support, political stability, and an advantageous alliance with another power. Many people, both in England and abroad, simply could not imagine a woman ruling successfully without a man at her side. But for Elizabeth, marriage was not a straightforward solution. In fact, it was a potential threat. If she married a foreign prince, England risked becoming entangled in European conflicts, or worse, overshadowed by a more powerful ally. The memory of Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain was still fresh. That match had been deeply unpopular, sparking unrest and rebellion, and many feared that England had come dangerously close to becoming a satellite of Spanish power. It had even led to England being dragged into a war with France and losing the last English stronghold on the continent, Calais. Elizabeth was determined not to repeat what she saw as her half-sister's mistakes. But marrying an English nobleman was equally problematic. Choosing one man would elevate him above all others, creating jealousy, factional rivalry, and possibly instability at court. Not what you need when you're new on the throne and in a world where rebellion could topple you. And then there was religion, which was always a central issue in Tudor England. A Catholic husband might reassure Catholic powers abroad, but would alarm Elizabeth's Protestant advisors and subjects. A Protestant husband, on the other hand, could provoke opposition from Catholic factions at home and abroad. There really was no safe choice, and Elizabeth understood this better than anyone. And so, rather than allowing marriage to limit her power, she turns it into a tool. She declared that she was married to her kingdom, a powerful piece of royal imagery, propaganda, that reinforced her independence and authority. But behind that image was a carefully calculated strategy. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth entertained a series of potential matches. There were negotiations with Philip II of Spain early on, later with Archduke Charles of Austria, and most famously with Francis, Duke of Anjou. Each proposal was considered, discussed, and prolonged, sometimes for years. Whether or not she ever intended to marry any of her suitors, she used these negotiations as a form of diplomacy. By keeping foreign powers hopeful, she maintained alliances, avoided conflict, and ensured that England remained an important player on the European stage. At the same time, this strategy allowed her to retain complete control at home. She ruled without a king consort, without sharing authority, and without placing herself in a position where her decisions might be influenced or overshadowed by a husband. Of course, this approach wasn't without its drawbacks. It caused frustration among her advisors, who worried constantly about the succession, and it fueled endless speculation and gossip, particularly regarding her close relationships with men like Robert Dudley. But for Elizabeth, the advantages of being the Virgin Queen outweighed the risks. By refusing to marry, she did something unprecedented. She maintained her independence in a world that expected her to surrender it. And let's not forget that childbirth was dangerous for a woman, so she was perhaps protecting her own life too. She'd seen 2 stepmothers die after giving birth. Moving on to religion. When Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, she inherited not just a crown, but a deeply divided kingdom. Religion had torn England apart for decades. Under her father, Henry VIII, the country had broken from Rome. Under her brother, Edward VI, England had moved firmly in a Protestant direction. And then, under her half-sister Mary I, Catholicism had been restored, along with the authority of the Pope. These weren't just changes in doctrine, they had real human consequences. People had been executed, imprisoned, and forced to conform as the country swung back and forth between 2 opposing faiths. By the time Elizabeth became queen, England was exhausted, unstable, and uncertain. Elizabeth understood that religion had the power to unite, but also to destroy. So, early in her reign, she set about creating a settlement that would bring stability. In 1559, Parliament passed 2 key pieces of legislation, the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity. The Act of Supremacy re-established the monarch as the head of the Church of England, breaking once again from Rome. But interestingly, Elizabeth took the title of Supreme Governor rather than Supreme Head, a more careful choice of wording, perhaps designed to make her position more acceptable to those uneasy with a woman holding spiritual authority. The Act of Uniformity, meanwhile, set out how religion would be practiced across the country. It introduced a revised Book of Common Prayer and made attendance at church services compulsory, creating a standard form of worship for the realm. Together, these acts formed what we now call the Elizabethan religious settlement. But what's particularly striking is Elizabeth's approach to this. At the time, she didn't pursue extremes. Instead, she aimed for what historians often describe as a middle way. Outwardly, England would be Protestant, services in English, the monarch as the head of the church. But there was, at least in the early years of her reign, a degree of flexibility in private belief. Elizabeth was less concerned with what people believed in their hearts than with outward conformity and national unity. Her aim wasn't to win a religious argument, but to stop conflict and heal the divisions. And for a time, this approach worked. The settlement brought a measure of stability to England after years of upheaval. It allowed Elizabeth to establish her authority and gave the country space to recover. But it's important to remember that this balance was delicate. It depended on compromise, on careful control, and on a shared willingness, at least outwardly, to conform. But that balance would become much harder to maintain as her reign went on. As Elizabeth established religious stability at home, she also had to secure her kingdom abroad. England in 1558 was not a dominant European power. It was vulnerable, financially weakened, religiously divided, and surrounded by larger, more established rivals like Spain and France. Elizabeth understood that survival depended not just on strength, but on strategy. And one of the most striking features of her reign is just how long she managed to avoid major war. For much of her 44-year rule, England experienced a period of relative peace, something quite remarkable in an age of constant conflict. And this wasn't accidental, it was the result of a careful, calculated diplomacy. Elizabeth and her advisors worked to maintain a delicate balance of relationships across Europe. With France, there had long been hostility, but Elizabeth steered relations towards a more stable footing, particularly as both countries shared concerns about Spanish power. Scotland, too, was crucial. It had historically been allied with France, the Old Alliance, as it was called, posing a potential threat to England from the north. But through a combination of diplomacy and circumstance, especially the shifting position of Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth was able to neutralise that danger and secure a more favourable relationship. But perhaps most interestingly, well, interesting to me, is that Elizabeth also looked beyond traditional European alliances. She developed diplomatic and trading relationships with the Ottoman Empire, an unusual move for a Christian monarch, but a highly strategic one. By fostering ties with Sultan Murad III, England gained valuable trading across the eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, and beyond. She also maintained relations with Russia, opening up new trade routes and strengthening England's commercial reach. And moving on to trade, in 1600 Elizabeth granted a charter to the East India Company, giving it a monopoly over English trade in vast regions of Asia. At the time, this may have seemed like just another commercial venture, but it marked the beginning of something much bigger. England was starting to look outward, beyond Europe, towards global trade and influence. So while Elizabeth is often remembered for the drama of events like the Spanish Armada, much of her success lay in what didn't happen. She avoided costly wars for decades. She kept powerful rivals at bay, and she positioned England as an increasingly connected, outward-looking and strategic nation. Alongside political stability and growing international confidence, Elizabeth's reign also saw something else flourish: culture. This is the part of her reign that most people recognise: the world of Shakespeare, of grand performances, of poetry, music, and intellectual curiosity. This is what we think of when we hear the phrase the Elizabethan Golden Age. In literature and theatre, this was an extraordinary period. William Shakespeare's plays were being performed in London in the 1590s, capturing everything from royal power to human ambition and tragedy. But he wasn't alone. Writers like Christopher Marlowe, with his bold and often controversial works, and Edmund Spenser, whose poetry celebrated both Elizabeth and the ideals of her reign, were shaping a vibrant literary culture. The theatre itself became a central part of urban life. Purpose-built playhouses like the Theatre and later the Globe and the Rose brought drama to a wide audience. From nobles to ordinary Londoners, it was a world of storytelling, performance and ideas, sometimes entertaining, sometimes provocative. And music too flourished. Composers like William Byrd and John Dowland created works that are still admired today. And what's particularly remarkable is how musicians like William Byrd were able to adapt across the religious changes of the Tudor period, producing both sacred and secular music in a rapidly shifting world. And beyond the arts, there was a growing sense of intellectual and scientific curiosity. Advances in navigation and cartography made long-distance voyages possible, supporting the age of exploration. Figures like John Dee, with his interests in mathematics, astronomy and navigation, were part of a broader culture that valued learning and discovery. There was also economic and commercial development. In 1571, Elizabeth opened the Royal Exchange in London, founded by Sir Thomas Gresham. It became a centre of trade and finance, a place where merchants from across Europe and beyond could meet and do business. It symbolised a growing confidence in England's economy and its place in the wider world. Taken together, these developments created something distinctive, a sense of energy, creativity, and expansion. But if there is one moment that defines Elizabeth's reign, well, I think it has to be the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. By this point, tensions with Spain had been building for years, and religion played a major role. Elizabeth was a Protestant queen in a Catholic world, and her excommunication by the Pope in 1570 had made her a target. But there were also political and economic factors at play, including English support for Protestant rebels in the Spanish Netherlands and attacks on Spanish ships by English privateers. Philip II of Spain, one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, decided to act. His plan was simple in theory: send a vast fleet, his Armada, to invade England, overthrow Elizabeth and restore Catholic rule. And in 1588 that fleet set sail. It was an intimidating force, around 130 ships carrying thousands of men, and on paper England stood little chance. But this wasn't just about numbers and strength, it was a battle of tactics. The English Navy, using smaller, faster ships, was able to harass the Spanish fleet, staying out of range while inflicting damage. Then came the use of fire ships. These were sent into the anchored Spanish fleet off the coast of Calais, causing chaos and forcing the Armada to scatter. And then, of course, there was the weather. Storms battered the Spanish ships as they attempted to retreat around Scotland and Ireland, what later became known in Elizabethan propaganda as the Protestant wind. God being on Elizabeth's side, of course. The result was a devastating defeat for Spain, and for England it was a moment of triumph. Elizabeth herself played a key role in shaping how this victory was remembered. Her famous speech to the troops at Tilbury, declaring that she had the heart and stomach of a king, became part of the mythology of her reign, reinforcing her image as a strong and capable ruler. The defeat of the Armada secured England from invasion, strengthened national identity, and elevated Elizabeth's reputation both at home and abroad. It was in many ways the high point of her reign. She truly was Gloriana. By the end of the 16th century, Elizabeth had ruled for decades, guided her kingdom through religious division, avoided foreign domination, and overseen a period of cultural brilliance and growing confidence. And it's no wonder her reign has been remembered as a golden age. But that wasn't the full story. And that's what I'm going to explore in my next video. So I'll see you soon. And please, please, please do click subscribe. I really want to get to 100,000 subscribers this year, and you clicking on that will really help. And please do share this video with anyone that you think would be interested in it. Thank you for following me.